Good afternoon, and thank you for joining the JCRC of Greater Washington for this important and timely discussion about education, curriculum, and identity. I am Rabbi Abby Sharofsky, JCRC's Director of Intergroup Relations and Rabbi in Residence. I'd like to begin by reflecting on this week's Torah portion, Vayetze, from the book of Genesis. Here we learn about Jacob's journey to Haran to find a wife, how he worked for his uncle Laban for 7 years in order to marry Laban's younger daughter Rachel, only to be tricked into marrying Leah, the older daughter. Jacob works 7 more years in order to marry Rachel, then 6 additional years to build his flocks. 20 years and no guarantee of consistent wages or a clear path to freedom. We also learn about Jacob's children during that time, the sons and daughter born to Jacob's wives and wives' maids. I remember a class from early in rabbinical school when a Bible professor offered translations and interpretations of this text that moved beyond an elementary understanding of the text. What did it mean that Rachel and Leah offered their maids to Jacob? Was Jacob a trickster, as we learned in our younger explorations of the text, or someone caught in an unbreakable cycle of sharecropping? The narrative was not as simple or unproblematic as we thought, and it was our job as rabbinical students to engage with the struggles of the text, with the hope of one day being rabbis who would show others how to wrestle with the text. To be Jewish, to be Am Yisrael, the people of Israel, the people who wrestle with God, we learned at that time, is to embrace the struggle and emerge stronger and more connected to our faith. It is with that struggle in mind that JCRC has created a space for this discussion. I am pleased to welcome 2 experts and thought leaders in the field, Dr. David Reese Jr., Director of the Office of Equity and Excellence for Prince George's County Public Schools, and Avi Edelman, Associate Director, Office of Multicultural Affairs and Manager of Diversity Education at Columbia University. Their full bios are available on the JCRC website, but a few highlights. Avi's areas of expertise include unconscious bias, privilege, and oppression, discussing these areas, unconscious bias, privilege and oppression, LGBTQ solidarity, anti-racism, building socially just practices, disability justice, exploring whiteness, and challenging anti-Semitism. Avi has worked with individuals and organizations across the country to develop inclusive practices and build spaces of trust and understanding and foster a culture of dialogue. David began his career in education as a high school social studies teacher, and his love of teaching history informs his work in creating systemic change in educational systems. Most recently, David has been part of the team that has brought a specific type of coherence to how Prince George's County Public Schools understands and approaches improvement. Our conversation will be moderated by Gila Franklin Siegel, Associate Director of JCRC of Greater Washington. Gila leads our agency in its extensive education outreach and advocacy efforts. An attorney by training, she has over 20 years' experience in Jewishly grounded community relations and social justice work. She is a frequent writer on topics related to American Jewish life, and her columns have been published in the Washington Post, The Forward, the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, and other media outlets. I'm happy to turn this over to Gila, and welcome again to our discussion.
Thank you, Abby, so much for those beautiful words of Torah. And thank you, Avi and David, for making time in your very busy schedules to be with us. Avi, I know that in addition to everything you're doing at Columbia, you're also in the midst of a huge project with dozens of Hillels around the country. And so I appreciate you making time. David, it's Always a pleasure. And the JCRC, through its education work, has the opportunity and responsibility to work with equity directors in all of our region's schools, both to advocate for and deal with the concerns and needs of Jewish parents and Jewish kids, and also to work in interfaith and intergroup coalition to ensure that our schools are welcoming and safe for all children. So thank you both for being here. And I'd like to start our conversation with David with some basic definitional terms and understanding, because I think that there's a lot of language floating around these days about education and curriculum. And I think it's important for people to get a good understanding of what goes on in classrooms. What is culturally responsive education and teaching, and how, if at all, does it relate to the current controversy and tons of writing and advocacy around the term critical race theory?
Well, thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here with everyone this afternoon. And before I answer that question, I just want to quickly introduce myself as a descendant of slaves who were brought to this country. I'm a Black American, and I am, as you heard in the introduction, a former social studies teacher. And in my curriculum, and I really want to thank Abai Swarovski for inviting us to engage critically with the text and centering us with Jacob and Genesis, because it was my job as an educator to center the founding documents of the United States of America for my students, the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, and speak truth about them in their context. And it was important for me to be able to do that in a critical way so that high school students could engage and learn deeply, and also foster a love for the promise that America offers and be proud to be Americans. So it is possible, and it's responsible responsible educators are doing an awesome job every day of helping students be critical, think hard, challenge, and still want to improve their condition and the condition of others. So when I think about your question that was asking around culturally responsive teaching, which sometimes gets the acronym CRT, as is critical race theory, culturally responsive teaching, in short, is the idea that we have a diverse, especially in the American context, students who come from a variety of faith traditions, of racial backgrounds, economic situations and circumstances, and from different nations. And teachers and those who are school facing have a responsibility to understand how to have conversations about race and difference, and how to understand the culture that people from various backgrounds enter into the learning space with, so that we don't inadvertently trigger or cause harm to our students as they're trying to engage in learning. So culture responsive teaching asks teachers to know how to validate and affirm students, and sometimes learn more about their cultural identity so that we can proactively intervene to make sure that they feel welcomed in spaces that might feel harmful to them. The main idea behind cultural responsive teaching is to make sure that students can be independent learners and not dependent on what the teacher says or what the text says, and that there are things that we can do as educators to help all students process information at high levels, engage rigorously with the text and with each other, so that strong learning can happen. So that's essentially it in its nutshell. And it asks for teachers and students to really enter into learning partnerships with one another. And I think on the critical race theory side, which has the acronym CRT as well, and that's something that came about because of Derek Bell and some others who were philosophers and legal scholars. Kimberly Crenshaw is another name. And essentially what they assert is that race and racism are constructs, and they are still real. And if you look at the American context and think about laws around who could marry whom, coming from different races, who could live where, connected to different races, who had real religious freedom or not, depending on their religious backgrounds, that we can see embedded into laws, explicit references to color that prevented or allow access to people over time. And that we cannot look at our current reality today without taking into account the history and the laws that have shaped our current context. Again, with the idea of being rigorous with the text and figuring out how we can still move forward and create a more pluralist democracy. And that's my own ad lib. And when I think about a pluralist democracy as a social studies teacher, it's the idea that there'll be many different centers of power that exist in the American context. And we all have to figure out how to form alliances and work together to achieve our aims. So thank you for that opening question. And you're on mute.
There. I'm going to follow up on what you just said, because I think that in this discourse that's been taking place over the last several months with increasing intensity, one of the responses that people have offered is, well, critical race theory is not taught in K-12 schools, so why are we discussing this? And there was a very thoughtful piece by Yasha Monk in The Atlantic over the weekend that addressed that answer. And basically what Yasha said was that we're making a mistake by so flippantly responding in that way, because even though critical race theory itself might not be taught, it's used most frequently in legal settings, law schools, that there are tenets of critical race theory that are present and are noticeable, that you can see, that are relied on in the way social studies is taught, the way race is taught, the way government is taught in K-12 schools. And we need to address that, not saying whether it's positive, not saying whether it's negative, but that it's too simplistic of a response. So I'm wondering if you could elaborate on what you just said in terms of your understanding of what critical race theory is, how that translates into the classroom, and if you see that, what its utility is, and whether there are challenges that you see in bringing this new framework, I don't know how new it is, but bringing this framework into the classroom.
So for me, I think it's about making sure that people have a clear baseline understanding of the facts around critical race theory and what the tenets are. And I just want to pick up on, and I'm going to try to tell a quick story, and I love the follow-up question. The fact, I think, let me start with this. In Charlottesville, Virginia, the situation that happened just a few years ago, there was a statement, and I want to, and because I'm with the JCRC, most people from the JCRC will know that there were signs and statements that said the Jews will not replace us. For me, as a history major and as a social studies teacher, as a person who studied religion in college and understand World War II history, that statement hit me in a place and sent up major red flags around how much work we have to do to make sure that we protect people and their safety. There were other people who might have heard that same phrase, the Jews will not replace us, and did not have the historical context or understanding to know how deeply problematic that extreme anti-Semitic statement was. And if we go back to Nuremberg laws and other laws that have existed globally, where we know that people can use legal power to prevent access or grant access and then create harmful situations for some people while centering others, like that for me is very important for young people to understand in terms of how democracies and how societies work and create or take away power from groups of people. So in the American context, because of the way that the chronology of the history flows, when you think about Native Americans and access and women as a group and access, and then you can think about African Americans and different groups, unfortunately, we don't get to specific history about other populations that have shown up more recently until we get to the 1900s or maybe the 1940s and begin to have that level of dialogue. So I think it's important to understand that tenet of critical race theory in terms of how the law can create opportunities or take opportunities away, so that as patterns emerge throughout our review of history, we can understand how this pattern happened to this group and granted access or took it away, and I can see it happening to other groups. And we have to pay attention to the conditions that get ripened to create othering, and create racism and create exclusion and allow us to see others as less human and less deserving and less American, less human, right? And so I think that I can connect critical race theory to the law, to how we see humanity. And it's important for students to engage early and often around those concepts, because it is about life or death.
Thank you so much, David. Avi. American Jews, for many of them, this whole conversation hits a very raw nerve. And what I see in my role at the JCRC is Jews being pushed and pulled from different directions. On the one hand, there's been a major push over the last several years to improve the quality and authenticity and depth of Holocaust education in public school systems. On the other hand, for those people who have been following it, there was an 18-month process in the state of California involving the introduction of a new ethnic studies curriculum that was widely panned by a range of Jewish organizations across the spectrum for being insufficiently attentive to the Jewish experience, dismissive of it, and even potentially triggering anti-Semitism or anti-Israel sentiment. Why does this hit such a nerve? Why does all of this and what David has just spoken about freak Jews out? Sometimes, some of them, even as we fight for and applaud all and participate in all of our collective efforts to achieve greater equity in society. Why is this so raw and sensitive for so many American Jews?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. And thanks to David. You know, what you shared really reminds me of something James Baldwin wrote about when he said history does not refer merely or even principally to the past. On the contrary, the great force of history comes from the fact that we carry it within us always. And so, you know, to respond to your question, Gila, you know, because I am Jewish, I'll do it in a roundabout way. I know better than to make any claims about all Jews, because if the famous joke is true, then as one Jew, I carry at least 1.5 opinions. But what I do know is that we are an idol-smashing people. We are a people who pursue truth even when to do so invites surus or hardship or even violence. We're a people who believe in reading the footnotes. In fact, the Talmud is so full of footnotes that the boundaries between central text and marginalia becomes blurry. And to me, that's why culturally responsive teaching is so important, because it asks us to move that which has been confined to the footnotes or erased completely into the center, not at the expense of what was there before, but in addition to it in an effort to find truth. And, you know, how does this connect to Jews and Jewish experiences? I recently came upon a 1980s piece by Professor Jonathan Sarna that begins by noting the tendency in Jewish historical scholarship for many decades to minimize anti-Semitism in the United States. And this is among Jewish scholars. And Sarna sort of opined that maybe these scholars felt that to disrupt the myth of America as a Garden of Eden would somehow betray the prosperity that many Jews have found here. But of course it doesn't, right? I want history to tell the truth, even and especially when it's hard to hear. That Peter Stuyvesant tried to keep us out of New Amsterdam, that General Grant scapegoated us and expelled us from the military, that Leo Frank was lynched, that colleges established quotas to keep us out, that country clubs and entire neighborhoods forbade us, that Nazis, to David's point, claimed we were attempting to replace them. And so I say, hell on anyone who tries to tell me that to talk about those things, which are my history and our truth, is to sow division or undermine patriotism or, make modern Christians feel too uncomfortable or feel too guilty. Certainly not when only 36% of millennials know that 6 million of us died in the Shoah. So telling the truth about our past is essential because, as Heschel said, we're a people in whom the past endures, in whom the present is inconceivable without a moment gone by. He said the Exodus lasted a moment enduring forever. What happened once upon a time happens all the time. And so for me, if we should tell the truth about our past, we should tell it about everyone's. And to your question, I do think some people hear the rhetoric attached to culturally responsive teaching, which sort of ironically was deliberately created to sow the very division it accuses that teaching of fomenting. And they think that we're replacing one set of idols with another, one set of simple truths with another. And I do think we can do a better job of illustrating, and David gave such a clear explanation of what culturally responsive teaching really is. I also know that, we've been here before. The same charge was levied against the progressive historians of the early 20th century who dared to suggest that the founding fathers acted in their economic self-interest. The same charge was levied in 1994 during the midterm elections about national curriculum reviews. This is an old song remixed for modern ears. But, when I think about, and we shouldn't ignore that, that's important it's important that we have these conversations so that we can work through the fears, we can unpack the rhetoric. At the end of the day, though, for me, culturally responsive teaching tells Jewish stories. It tells Black stories. It tells LGBTQ stories. It tells Black Jewish LGBTQ stories. And it tells those stories like the Talmud does, with the marginalia moved into focus and with no truth, which includes strength, resilience, pain, and joy, with no truth left out. So to me, that's what culturally responsive teaching really is and why it's so important as a Jewish person to embrace it.
I keep being muted while you were speaking, so I apologize. Thank you. What you said about Jonathan Sarna's article, I think Dara Horn also writes about in her new book, People Love Dead Jews, which is a very compelling read, about how Jews have tried to minimize anti-Semitism. And I think that has waned, and now we find ourselves in a situation where we are keenly aware of anti-Semitism and really vigilant about it. So what would you say to a parent? And, we at JCRC saw this in the spring during the war between Israel and Hamas, when there is a teacher, regardless of what the written curriculum says and regardless of what the official policy is, when you have a teacher, a social studies teacher who is talking about the Jewish lobby and Jews as aggressors or oppressors or people with overweening power. If the new trend in curricular advancements focuses on power structures and focuses on the untold stories, how can we support that, both in terms of, as you said, really students learning the hard truths about anti-Semitism and about racism, while still being vigilant about the pieces that maybe don't exactly get it right, or the teachers in the classrooms who may not take the thoughtfulness of the framework that you and David have laid out and implement it appropriately in their classrooms. What would you say to Jewish parents who are concerned about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think what I would say is that that illustrates how important it is that we have culturally responsive education, right? And the examples you shared, I would call not culturally responsive. David talked about meeting the needs of individual students, empowering them to think critically, to weigh the forces of history, and importantly, crucially, to think about what that should mean for their own responsibility to their world today. Because if we're not asking that question, then what's the point of learning about history? And, what culturally responsive education asks us to do is grapple with those things and weigh those things. And, I think, unfortunately, one of the reasons that some of the distortions that we've been talking about, some of the rhetoric, it's so much easier for those to take hold than the truth because those are easier to package, right? Like oppressor versus oppressed, that's so palatable, but that's not what culturally responsive education is. Culturally responsive education asks us to understand that we each contain multitudes, and there are larger forces that shape how different parts of our experience move through the world as we navigate our different communities and contexts. It doesn't explain any one person's story. It gives us tools about what's out there so that we can tell our own stories and convey our values. And the other thing I'll say is that it's not a zero-sum game. That, when it's not done well, we should push that it be done well, right? It should be better. It should do all of the things we're saying. And that it's, too often I think it gets pitted for Jews. And I know a little later, maybe we'll talk about sort of this idea of privilege and what does that mean for Jews. But I think sometimes it gets pitted as our stories versus someone else's stories. And one, there's overlap in all our community stories because we have overlapping experiences and identities. And two, culturally responsive education has room for all of our stories. So I think that's one of the things that I would say in response to your question.
Great, thank you. So, David, one of the issues that I hear people speaking about a lot is how culturally responsive education in the realm of American history and in the realm of teaching about race assesses responsibility and confers responsibility. And there seems to be some kind of backlash of people saying, well, that happened then. I was not responsible for that. Why are we learning about that now? And why are my children learning to be disdainful of the United States, to not be proud of our citizenship and of our nation? And why is there this push for our students to feel pressured to be anti-racist, to be that they have to establish their bona fides or else they need to be culpable or feel shame? I know that that is what I hear from parents and from electeds sometimes in this work. So I think it's important to put it on the table and just ask you what you think about that, whether you think that portrayal relates to what you see happening in classrooms in your school district and what you see happening in terms of the teacher training that occurs in your school district and your own work as a teacher, as an educator in the classroom.
So thank you for asking that question. And it's so interesting as you were asking it, just the idea that, and I've heard this a lot too, we weren't, and I'll go back to American slavery so I can carry that theme through. Nobody in my family owned slaves. I understand that it was a horrible institution with everything that's attached to it, but I wasn't responsible for it. My children weren't responsible for it. And in some ways for me, I think that it's a little escapist, and I think it prevents a lot of learning from happening. Because whereas there were lots of sins committed in slavery by people who owned slaves and by people who were complicit, there are also lots of stories of virtues that happened from white people, from people who tried to resist the institution, from white women who were teaching slaves to read, even though it was illegal to do so. So I feel like when we have a more complete understanding of the complexity of human nature and how humans can treat other humans in terrible ways, and also sometimes humans will risk their own personal safety to advance the cause for others who people might not think are like them, I think is important for students to understand, because we are all beneficiaries of the legacies of this nation for people who are living here. So I would invite parents who might have expressed some of the sentiments that you just put out there to ask themselves to think differently about the responsibility that we have to learn about the virtues and the sins, so that we can better advocate for one another and see how we can help more of our children. You know, it's interesting because I actually have right here next to me a book. This book is Anti-Racist, which was a book study that our CEO, Dr. Monica Golson, hosted for about 1,000 people in Prince George's County who opted into it. And we chose this book for a number of reasons. It's by an author named Tiffany Jewell. And, you know, and it says 20 lessons on how to wake up, take action, and do the work. And as we were reading the book in the book study, and we talked about systemic racism and oppression and all of those things, and we also talked about identity and what does it mean to discriminate against people. We talked about different religions and religious identity and ways that people from different backgrounds experience pain and oppression connected to their identity. So this idea of anti-racism, especially in the American context, can often be oversimplified as connecting directly to Black people and Black Lives Matter or the Black liberation struggle. But being anti-racist is asking us to actually actively understand that racism exists, sexism exists, lots of isms exist, and we have to do the work to actively subvert racist policies and racist actions that are in place. So again, I think that the binaries that get presented are really easy. There's easy on social media to say, you know, this political party good, this political party bad. This religion is the one that is good, this is the one that's problematic. And real rigorous instruction and open and honest dialogue about difference can allow people to be much more nuanced, because as Avi was saying, we are the intersections of a lot of different identities. People are complex, extremely complex and extremely nuanced. And we should expect that our teachers should be equipped, and that systems like mine should do the work to help teachers develop their capacity to become increasingly nuanced as we have a changing demographic, and people have folks in their classrooms who look and have experienced life very differently than the teacher. So if we don't responsibly support teachers in learning more about identities, ways of being, so that every student can be affirmed, then we're missing our mark in helping America become even better than it already is.
And I will certainly say nuance is our favorite word at the JCRC, which is why this program is called Behind the Headlines, in terms of really trying to understand and help our kids to understand things are not all one way or the other, that there's a complexity to all of this. There are some really terrific questions coming in, but before we get to them, I do want to ask Avi one more question, which is, and you began to allude to it before, the whole issue of privilege. And because that ties into what David was talking about how we are the beneficiaries, regardless of when my great-grandparents came here, regardless of when my grandparents came here. The idea that I'm a beneficiary of a system that inherently at the get-go was stacked against particular groups of people in our society. And Jews really seem to be struggling with that in the term white privilege, white supremacy, Jews being complicit, being with white supremacy, how can Jews think about themselves and the term privilege in a way that doesn't detract from at all our identity as a marginalized group that came here after millennia of persecution, right? And that it doesn't detract from the fact that we're not Christian, and that we are a minority faith, and that our experience as Americans is influenced and colored and shaped by that every day. Why are we grappling with it, and how can we think about that, and how should we think about that?
So the question, even as you just set that up, right? Each of those things you shared are positioned as things that can't be true at the same time, which they can be, and that's right. Education should push us to hold multiple truths simultaneously and dig into the complexities and the challenges of what it means to hold those truths at the same time. So, if I had to boil down what is privilege, I would describe it as the experience of having part of who you are normalized in the world. It means the default expectations are built around your identity. And it doesn't mean that you have it easy all of the time. It just means that challenges are likely not compounded by that part of who you are. So for example, when I was a white student in mostly white classrooms with mostly white teachers, I still had some good experiences and some bad ones, but the bad ones were not because I had to worry about a teacher shaping their expectations of me based on my race. And privilege goes beyond whiteness. And that, I think, brings in your point. I work at an institution, as do most people, that is structured around the Christian calendar. So we get off on Christmas, we don't get off on Yom Kippur. And sometimes important community events are held on Yom Kippur. That's annoying, that's frustrating. And it doesn't mean that my Christian colleagues are oppressors, but it means they should understand that we're operating in a world built around their experience and not built around mine. And they should use that understanding of privilege to make inclusive choices. For example, not holding a program on Yom Kippur. That's a choice someone can make. And so when it comes to Jews, I'd say also the concept of white privilege is especially important because not all Jews are white. In fact, there are more Jews of color in the United States than Orthodox Jews. And so we should be talking about white privilege in Jewish spaces because it will help us make our synagogues and our institutions more welcoming, which is to say, more holy and more Jewish. White privilege for me is when I walk into a synagogue, no one asks me if I'm Jewish or if I can produce ID or if I'm a caterer. Unfortunately, nearly all of my friends who are Jews of color have had that experience. And so for me, understanding privilege is essential not to produce guilt or shame. That's too often where we get stuck, but rather to give us tools to build better communities. If we can see that dynamic in action in synagogues, we can create norms and policies and trainings that are thoughtful about challenging those things. I'll give you one more example. My grandfather, whose memory continues to be a blessing, served in the Korean War on a Navy ship. This Jewish boy was assigned to be the assistant to the Catholic and the Protestant chaplains on the boat. And there were a number of misunderstandings, but the truth is he loved learning, and so he embraced that role. Anyway, he has a photograph of someone he became friendly with on the ship who was a Black soldier. And that soldier wasn't Jewish, but accompanied my grandfather on a visit to a synagogue in Spain during a stopover. And I really love this photo of the two of them smiling in their uniform. After the war ended, my grandfather had access to the GI Bill. It paid for 100% of his doctorate, even for a typist to help him complete his dissertation. It helped him secure low-interest home loans. These benefits were likely not conferred to his friend, as they were denied to many Black soldiers. This doesn't take away from my grandfather's grit. I mean, this man grew up poor and malnourished in Flatbush in Brooklyn and worked hard to elevate his family's status. But if we can understand how race aided in his journey and hindered the journey of his fellow soldier, we can think about our responsibility to challenge inequality in our world. And without guilt or shame, but just with moral certainty that each of us can play roles to build the world we've been looking for. So that's what privilege means to me.
So, Avi, as you were speaking, there was something that you mentioned that actually connects back to one of my favorite lessons that we're working on in Prince George's County around culturally responsive teaching. And so we do a lot of work around the brain and how the brain works. And our Division of Academics has done this year-long book study, and we're actively looking at the curriculum and making adjustments. But there's one part of culturally responsive education that really helps us understand the amygdala and how the brain functions. And there's this concept called the amygdala hijack. So the amygdala is a part of the brain that's the oldest part of the brain that people call the reptilian brain, and is responsible for that flight or fight response whenever you sense that there's some sort of danger that's happening. And culture responsive education asks us to become more aware of our triggers around race and culture. And what are those things that help us move to a space of defensiveness or attack or justification, which could be fight, literally the fight. And when that happens, when you're in this amygdala hijack, it's harder to take an angry stance, to listen, to hear other perspectives. And so sometimes when we're triggered, we get into these fights, and those fights prevent deeper learning and deeper discourse from happening, and we can't hear nuance and the perspectives that other people have. And so that's one of the things that we're really trying to begin supporting our teachers with understanding better, because this is happening for lots of students when they feel like they're not experiencing safety in dialogue. And it happens for adults too. When we don't experience safety, we will find ways to create a safe space for ourselves. And sometimes that could undermine our actual desire to become more inclusive, to become more opening, and to become more welcoming.
So we have some fabulous questions here, and I want to get through as many of them as possible. So some of the questions focus on a concern that the modality of teaching, whether you call it culturally responsive education, introducing elements that focus on structural racism, that it diminishes the importance of individuality and individual responsibility and accountability, and that it also crowds out a focus on looking at current equity issues and lifting up students who are experiencing academic loss, academic gaps, and are not getting the tools that they need and skills to succeed. So both the diminishment of individuality and the not focusing enough on the real needs of real students now.
That's a really heavy question that will require another hour-long conversation, and I'm so appreciative of it. And in the question, just the idea of diminishing individuality. For lots of cultures, the concept of the individual is less important than the concept of the collective. And when we think about different cultures and how they orient themselves to collective work and responsibility, supporting one another, and then there are others where it's the individual gets to make choices and is the agent and is what matters. And so that's a really interesting duality that's posed even in the framing of the question around diminishing the individual. And yeah, so that's, oh my gosh, there's so many places I want to go with that one. But I don't see emphasizing groups and people and their experiences as necessarily diminishing the individual. But I'm going to pause there to see if Avi has a response, because I have so many ways that I want to think about responding to that one.
What I'll share, and I'll try to pull in, I think there's another question about what do we mean when we talk about lived experiences. And so the thing that comes to mind for me, and again, I work on a college campus. I can't speak to what happens in a K-12 classroom. And in Montgomery County or Prince George's County, today. I can speak to my experiences as a student in those systems. But when we talk about culturally responsive education at the college level, when I lead a dialogue program, we'll tend to start exactly with individual experiences. We're all experts in our own stories, right? And how we've navigated our world, how we see the world, how the world sees us. We're all experts in that. So we'll often start with prompts that encourage people to explore that. And then as we put those different individual experiences into dialogue, we'll start to look at, what are bigger systems and structures that have shaped some of those stories? They don't explain every part of every individual narrative, but what are some of those forces when we talk about the ways in which harmful ideologies get codified into law, into policy, into, cultural norms? What's at play that shapes how we come to learn about ourselves and the world? And then we'll go right back to the community, as David talked about, the collective. What can we as a community commit to build a world that's more inclusive than the one we've inherited? And then what do each of us as individuals have to do to carry that forward? And so I think we actually spend a lot of time talking about individual experiences and about contemporary issues, and the framework of understanding what's shaped everything that leads us into the space we're in today. It doesn't stop with history. The history then informs how we talk about what we're seeing day to day. Again, back to, Charlottesville, Jews will not replace us. We have to look at that in connection to the history that shaped it, because that's going to give us more tools to know how we can challenge it.
Some of the questions concern the nitty-gritty operations of school systems. And David, that is, we can have a discussion about theory and about American values. And, parents are very concerned with what's happening at that nitty-gritty level. And one of the questions that was raised is that school systems, certainly many school systems, if not all of them in our area, have retained outside contractors to provide DEI services, to help with curricular work, and that regardless of what your framework is, or the framework of the curriculum directors within the school system, that these outside contractors that are coming in to influence the culture of the school system often don't have that nuanced, complex, holistic approach, and are really kind of more focused on a simplistic delivery of this message and of this kind of cultural change. And I can offer an example that JCRC had maybe a couple of months ago, where there was a school in Northern Virginia that had put onto its website a link to materials from an organization called Woke Kindergarten. And within that, there was kind of like a Kahoot, kind of question and answer thing for kids to engage with. And one of them was, what would happen if the United States took all the money it gives to Israel and took it away from them and gave it away? And it seemed to come out of left field and was not related, and it was meant for K through first grade. And I think if I asked my colleagues in that school system who I work with on a day-to-day basis about that, which we did, it was immediately taken down. It did not match what the equity office, what the everyone, principals and teachers all believed, but it happened. So how do you address that, given the fact that there's so much happening in the area of DEI now, and so much effort to bring in experts and have these facilitated dialogues and curriculum changes?
So this is a great question. And one thing our CEO, Dr. Golson in Prince George's County, did was she ensured that there were people inside of the district who had skin in the game, literally, who had to face our diverse community every day, that we were the ones responsible for the messaging and leading the work connected to diversity, equity, and inclusion and cultural responsiveness. So there are a couple things. One, when you have, it can be very difficult though for someone who is internal in an organization to be the person or the group who raises issues that are difficult for people to grapple with. That is why school districts often revert to someone from the outside, because it's somewhat easier to have an external person who's not in the heat of it to help people come to terms with certain things. But then, as you said, there is a lack of nuanced understanding, and maybe things don't get handled in the best ways. So I would suggest that school districts, and I'm going to make a position on how you should handle it, but I will say that you have a responsibility to vetting material, to working with external consultants and contractors to know what the learning experience will be so that you can support them in tailoring it so that you don't have to do the cleanup work in the back. Because the idea is you're supposed to talk about hard issues, but you have to do so in a responsible way that invites people into learning and getting better as opposed to creating more division.
Thank you. I'm just looking through some of these questions. They come, one person raised the issue of the 1619 project, whether that's being used, and how that intersects with Jewish concerns. Avi, maybe you can pick up on that, because again, we have really focused very hard in the last few years on Holocaust education. And the other piece that we have really focused on is being allies in the struggle for racial justice certainly after the murder of George Floyd. So I think all of these pieces converge and come at Jewish parents. And so the question was, should the Jewish community be concerned about teaching along the lines of the 1619 project? Does Montgomery County teach that? You would have no way to know that. But if you could speak to that a little bit, I think that would be helpful.
Sure. I think to try to keep it brief, there's a New York Times Magazine piece that I think just came out in the last few days that's all about the history of the backlash to the 1619 project. And it really connects it to, and I cited a little bit of this, the history of historiography, essentially, of how we have gone about telling the history of our country, and how different interventions in the telling of that history have engendered different pieces of pushback, often with similar themes, this fear that we're somehow tearing down the myth of a perfect America by naming all of the challenges our nation has had to come through. So I think there's a lot to be learned from that piece, in terms of, again, how that should shape us as Jews and how we look at this education work. Judaism is extremely clear. Judaism calls for racial justice. Judaism believes it's not our work to complete the task, nor are we free to desist from it. And to your point, this form of teaching is what ensures that Holocaust education will be robust and meaningful and truthful. And when we see people questioning, right, what if we can teach the other side of the Holocaust? That's the same line of thought that says, why do we have to only, what's the counter narrative that, why can't we talk about the heritage of Confederate statues, right? There's a link between those ideologies. And when we do truthful and responsive education, it elevates the truthful telling of Jewish history. And so that's something I think is very important. And of course, to your point, there are going to be cases where it's done wrong, just as there are cases in the standard telling of history, that are wrong, right? There are textbooks that are still in existence today that talk about enslavement as if it was something that largely benefited enslaved people and that plantation owners weren't that bad. That's just as repulsive as someone putting up an age and topic inappropriate slide for kindergartners. Those are both wrong. Let's talk about what's right. Let's talk about what's responsible. Let's talk about what pushes us to ask those challenging questions.
Great. And Avi, you answered another question that somebody had just asked. So thank you for that. I know for everybody online with us now, we have only been able to get to a fraction of the questions that you asked. But that's why this is a two-part series. And next week, we'll be sending information out today or tomorrow about the webinar that we will be doing 1 week from today at 12:30 p.m. With my colleagues from Dallas and from San Francisco, Ty Gregory, the JCRC director in San Francisco, and Nita Zusman-Eddy, the CRC director in Dallas, who are going to talk about how all of these issues have played out in real time in their communities. So on the one hand, the ethnic studies curriculum process, where the Jewish community fought so hard to have the curriculum have a more balanced treatment of Jews and of Israel, and the recent Texas controversy over the request or instruction to teach both sides of the Holocaust. And we'll also be joined by the CEO of Jimena, which is an organization dedicated to Jews who are not white, and how they were involved through their multiple identities and intersectionality of their constituents in this whole realm of public policy making. So please keep an eye out for that. And we will keep track of the questions that were asked. I want to thank David and Avi so much for your time, for your candor, for your heart. These are really difficult issues. And I think, people of good faith come to the table feeling very conflicted. And for me, the whole notion of nuance and carrying both two truths at the same time is something Jews in our Talmudic tradition have lots of training for. We're kind of hardwired for that. So I hope we can do that going forward. And I look forward to continuing to work with you both in this space. So thank you so much.